They told her the wild Mustangs would never forgive a human. They told her the rules were there for a reason. But on a flood-swollen morning in the heart of Wyoming, Ranger Claire Donovan was about to break every single one of them. She saw a young stallion, drowning, caught in the raging Bighorn River. An act of compassion, a quick rescue, that's all it should have been. The horse saved, the herd vanishing back into the wild where they belonged. But that's not what happened. Not even close. Because after she pulled him from the water, the Mustangs did something impossible. Something no one had ever seen. Something that would rewrite the very laws of nature she had sworn to protect. The morning air was cold enough to steal your breath. Mist crawled across the ground like a ghost, clinging to the sagebrush. In the distance, the mountains wore a crown of snow, sharp and jagged against a sky the color of lead. This wasn't the Wyoming you see on postcards. This was something raw. And the Bighorn River, usually a calm blue ribbon, was a monster. It was brown and angry, swollen with melted snow and days of hard rain. The water roared, a deep guttural sound that shook the earth. It chewed at the banks, swallowing trees and spitting out ice chunks the size of small cars. This was a river with a grudge. Ranger Claire Donovan drove her truck along a muddy track, the roar of the water a constant companion. She'd been with the Park Service for 10 years, seen it all, or so she thought. She was 34, known for being steady, competent, a woman who followed the book. The rules were her armor. They'd kept her alive more than once. Her hair was pulled back tight. Her uniform was clean. The only thing out of place was the mud caked on her boots from yesterday's patrol. She kept the window cracked, listening, always listening, to the whisper of the wind, the rustle of a deer, any sound that didn't belong. But this morning, the only voice was the river's, and it was screaming. A sudden blast of static from the radio made her jump. She grabbed the handset. "Donovan!" The dispatcher's voice crackled, sharp and urgent. "Base to Donovan. We've got multiple distress calls. Unusual Mustang activity near Grid Delta 7. Research team is flagging it. Proceed to check immediately." Multiple distress calls. The words echoed in her head. Mustangs don't distress easily. They were survivors, tough as the rock they stood on. If something had them spooked enough for a research team to call it in, it was bad. "Copy," she said, her voice tight. "On my way. ETA 15 minutes. She slammed the handset back in its cradle and wrestled the truck down a narrow side road, mud flying everywhere. The wheel bucked in her hands. Every bump jarred her teeth, but she leaned forward, pushing the truck faster. Her stomach was a hard knot. She'd heard a horse scream in terror only twice in her life. It was a sound that scraped your soul raw. And the dispatcher said multiple calls. This wasn't a stallion fight. This wasn't a lost foal. This was different. The roar of the river grew louder, drowning out the sound of her engine. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and something else. Fear. She crested a small rise and slammed on the brakes. The truck skidded to a stop on a bluff overlooking the water. She killed the engine, and the world was nothing but the roar of the flood. She grabbed her binoculars, her hands slick with sweat. She scanned the churning water, a chaotic mess of branches, logs, and debris. Nothing, just the river's rage. Then something moved, a dark shape, fighting the current, not flowing with it. She twisted the focus knob, her heart hammering against her ribs. The image sharpened. It was a horse, a young colt, his pale grey coat plastered to his skin, dark with water. His eyes were wide, the whites showing, filled with a terrifying light. He was thrashing, his front legs beating the water into a froth. But he was going nowhere, and then she saw why. His back legs were tangled, bound together by a dark, ugly mass of something that wasn't natural. She zoomed in closer, a cold dread washing over her. It was netting, a filthy snarl of nylon fishing line and shredded plastic, wrapped tight around his legs like a cage. Every time he kicked, the net pulled tighter, dragging him down. The colt's head went under. 1 second he was there, fighting, the next he was gone, swallowed by the brown water. "Come on," she whispered, her voice a raw plea. "Breathe." His head exploded back to the surface. He coughed, water streaming from his nostrils. A strangled, desperate cry tore from his throat. A sound of pure, unadulterated terror, the sound of a creature drowning. And in that moment, something flickered on the far bank. She swung the binoculars over, and her blood ran cold. They were not alone. A herd of Mustangs stood on the opposite shore, 10 of them, watching. At their head was a massive black stallion, jet black except for a jagged white scar that cut down his shoulder like a bolt of lightning. He stomped the ground, his muscles coiled like steel cables. He threw his head back and screamed a challenge at the river, a roar of fury and grief that was deeper, more powerful than the colt's cry of fear. She knew this stallion. The researchers called him Storm, a legend, a king, and he was watching his family die. The mares paced nervously, their ears pinned back, their calls sharp and frantic. One of them waded into the water, only to be driven back by the savage current. The foals huddled close to their mothers, their small bodies trembling. The entire herd was a single, unified knot of anguish. It wasn't just instinct. It was a family, helpless, gathered for a funeral. Claire fumbled for her radio, her hand shaking so badly she could barely press the button. "Base, this is Donovan. I'm at Delta 7. She took a ragged breath, her eyes locked on the struggling colt. "I have a visual. It's a young Mustang, trapped mid-river. His legs are entangled in debris. Human debris." She swallowed hard. "The rest of the herd is on the far bank. They're in significant distress, requesting instructions." Her words were professional, by the book. But inside she was screaming. The colt was getting weaker, his movements were slower, more sluggish. He couldn't last much longer. The radio crackled back to life. The voice was cold, hard, devoid of any emotion. "Copy that, Donovan. Negative on intervention. I repeat, negative." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. "Observe and record only. That is the protocol." The line went dead. Observe and record. Let nature take its course. She gripped the radio, her knuckles turning white. She had followed that rule for 10 years, believed in it. It was the core of her training. You are a guardian, not a god. You do not interfere. Interference destroys the balance. She remembered the stories, whispered among rookies, of rangers who broke the rule. Careers ruined, lives upended, all for a single act of compassion. The service was a cruel master. But this wasn't nature. This wasn't a test of survival. The river was a monster because of human dams upstream. The net around the colt's legs was woven by human hands. This wasn't nature's course, this was a murder scene, and humanity was the killer. If she stood here and did nothing, she wasn't a guardian, she was an accomplice. The colt's head went under again. This time it stayed down longer. 1 second, 2, 3. Just when she thought he was gone for good, he burst back up, choking, his body convulsing. Across the river, the herd erupted. Storm reared up on his hind legs, a magnificent silhouette of rage against the grey sky. His scream ripped through the valley, a sound of pure defiance. The mares joined in, their cries a high, keening chorus of grief. The sound hit Claire like a physical blow. It wasn't just noise, it was a song, a lament, a family crying out in one voice for their dying son. Her training, her rules, her career. They all shattered into a million pieces. The radio crackled at her hip again. "Donovan, do not intervene. That is a direct order." She stared at the struggling colt, at the grieving herd, at the human trash that was killing him. 2 paths lay before her. One was safe, obedient, the path of a good ranger. The other led to ruin. But it was the only path that led to the colt. A whisper in her soul grew into a roar. "If you do nothing, you are guilty." Her eyes locked on the colt's pale, struggling form. "This isn't nature," she said, her voice a low growl. "This is our fault." And in that instant, there was no choice left to make. She unclipped the radio from her belt and let it fall into the mud. She turned and wrenched open the back of her truck. The metal lid slammed open with a deafening clang. Inside was her emergency kit, the tools of a rescuer. She pulled on the orange life vest, her movements fast and jerky. She grabbed her knife, the blade already locked open, and secured it to her wrist. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she hauled out the inflatable raft. She unrolled it on the muddy ground and twisted the valve on the air canister. The raft hissed to life, inflating with a roar that seemed to shake the valley. Sweat poured down her face. This was insane. This was career suicide. She was breaking the most sacred rule of the park service. She risked a glance across the river, and what she saw made her freeze. The herd hadn't run. They stood their ground, watching her every move. Storm, the black stallion, was rigid, his eyes locked on her. The mares had stopped their frantic pacing, even the foals were still, their wide, dark eyes moving from the drowning colt to her. By all logic, they should have bolted at the sight of a human, at the sound of the hissing raft. Wild horses don't stick around. But they did. They weren't watching her with fear. They were watching her with hope. The realization hit her like a tidal wave. They weren't just watching a rescue. They were asking for one. Somehow, impossibly, they were trusting her. "All right," she breathed, her voice shaking. "I'm coming." She dragged the heavy raft to the water's edge. The river roared, spitting spray in her face. It was a living beast, and she was about to step into its mouth. She shoved the raft into the water. It bucked and twisted, trying to tear itself from her grasp. She fought it, her boots sinking into the mud, her muscles screaming. For a terrifying moment, she thought the river would win, that it would flip the raft before she could even get in. "Not today," she hissed, yanking the tether hard. She looked across the water one last time. Storm stomped his hoof and let out a cry so piercing, so powerful, it cut through the roar of the flood. It wasn't a cry of grief anymore, it was a command, a call to arms, and it was directed at her. A strange, cold calm washed over her. The fear was gone, burned away by a fierce, impossible purpose. She wasn't alone in this. She hauled herself into the raft, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. She fumbled with the rope that tied her to the shore, to safety, to the rules. With a single decisive motion, she sliced it clean through. The river seized the raft and yanked her into the churning chaos. She grabbed the paddle and dug it into the water, fighting to steer toward the colt. The small boat bucked and spun, a toy in the river's grip. Freezing water crashed over the side, soaking her to the bone. It wasn't paddling, it was a brawl, a battle of will against the raw power of the flood. She risked a glance at the shore. The herd was running, galloping along the bank, keeping pace with her. Storm was at their head, a black phantom against the grey landscape, his mane flying like a battle flag. He screamed again, and the mares answered, their voices weaving together into a wild, powerful anthem. The sound filled her, chasing away the last of her fear. It was fuel. It was strength. They were with her. She paddled harder, her lungs burning, her muscles on fire. The world shrank to a single point, the pale, struggling form of the colt just ahead. She was no longer just a ranger, she was an answer to a prayer, and she paddled straight into the heart of the storm. The river was a wild animal, trying to throw her from its back. A wave crashed over the side, blinding her. She spat out muddy water and dug the paddle in deeper. The current grabbed the bow, trying to spin her, but she fought it, her shoulders screaming in protest. This wasn't just water, it was a liquid predator. It pulled and twisted, eddies forming like whirlpools, trying to suck her down. Her breaths came in short, sharp bursts. Her heart was a jackhammer in her chest. The colt was just ahead, being swept towards a line of standing waves, a meat grinder that would pull him under and never let him go. "Hold on," she shouted, the wind snatching the words from her mouth. She could see him clearly now. The terror in his eyes, the way his body was contorted by the tangle of human garbage. The nylon lines had cut deep into his legs. Blood streamed from the wounds, vanishing instantly into the brown water. His head went under. He came back up, coughing, a broken, wheezing sound. He was failing. "Just a little longer," she yelled. She aimed the raft for his shoulder, a desperate attempt to get close without being struck by a flailing hoof. A cross-current hit her out of nowhere. The raft shot sideways. A wave lifted it, tilting it at a terrifying angle. For one heart-stopping second, she was looking down at the churning water, sure she was going over. She threw her weight to the other side, and the raft slapped back down with a jarring thud. She was close now, so close. The colt saw her, his head whipped around, his eyes wild with panic. He thrashed, a hoof striking the water right where she'd been a second before. If that blow had landed, it would have torn the raft to pieces. "Easy now," she said, her voice low and steady, trying to project a calm she didn't feel. "I'm here to help. I'm going to get you free." She let the river carry her the last few feet, until the bow of the raft bumped gently against his shoulder. He froze. Every muscle in his body quivered. She could feel the vibrations through the rubber. He didn't strike. He didn't fight. He just watched her, his exhausted eyes filled with a desperate, dawning understanding. He knew. Somehow he knew. Claire didn't waste the moment. She tethered her paddle and leaned out over the churning water, her arm submerged to the shoulder in the freezing current. She found the nylon cords with her fingers. They were slick with slime and blood. "Okay," she whispered, as much to herself as to the horse. "We're going to cut this." She flipped open her knife. The river pushed against her, trying to shove her away. She braced herself against the raft and started to saw at the first line. The nylon was tough, resisting the blade. It was a slow, grueling process. The colt shuddered but held still. He jerked once, a spasm of pain, and her stomach clenched. One good kick, and they were both dead. But he held. He held still. A strangled sound, half sob, half laugh, escaped her lips. "Good boy," she whispered, and attacked the next line. It was a nightmare of knots and tangles. Her fingers were numb with cold, but she kept cutting. Cut, reset, cut, breathe. The last loop of plastic had dug so deep into his flesh, it had left a gruesome channel. She had to work the tip of the blade under it, feeling the steel scrape against bone. The colt let out a soft sound, a rough exhalation, as if telling her he could bear it, that he understood. The final strand was as thick as cable. She gritted her teeth and put all her weight into it, sawing back and forth. And then, with a loud snap, the blade broke through. Everything happened at once. The colt's hind legs kicked free with a surge of power. The sudden release sent Claire tumbling backward. The raft rocked violently, taking on water. The colt was free, but he was also spent. His legs churned weakly once, twice, and then he began to sink. The last of his strength was gone. His head dipped under the water. "No!" The word was a command, torn from her throat. She lunged forward, grabbing a fistful of his wet mane. With her other hand, she fumbled for the rescue line at her hip. She clipped one end to the raft, looped the rope under his chest, and clipped it shut. He sagged against the line, a dead weight, his body surrendering to the river. The raft groaned, dragged down by his weight. "Don't you dare quit on me," she snarled, her teeth clenched. "Not now." The current grabbed them both, pulling them downstream toward a cluster of submerged rocks. She grabbed her paddle and dug it into the water, heaving with every ounce of strength she had left. The colt's muzzle broke the surface. He blew out a long spray of water, his eyes glassy and unfocused. "Listen to me," she shouted. "You can do this. Swim." One of his ears twitched. His legs began to move, slow, clumsy, but purposeful. They found a rhythm. She paddled. He kicked. His head rose. She pulled. His head sank. She lifted. It was a desperate, clumsy dance for survival. On the far bank, the herd was still running with them. Storm's powerful cries echoed across the valley, not of grief now, but of encouragement. A signal. A beacon. Every time the stallion called out, the colt seemed to find another ounce of strength. Ahead, a sliver of white appeared through the brown chaos. A sandbar. Salvation. It was only 30 meters away, but it might as well have been a mile. The current was strongest here, funneling them into a narrow, fast-moving channel. The raft surged forward and then bucked, hit by a standing wave. Water poured over the bow, slapping Claire in the face. The colt was dragged sideways, his head going under again. "Here!" she screamed, yanking on the rope, pulling him back from the brink. Suddenly, Storm's voice cut through the air like a crack of thunder. It was a raw, electric scream of command. The colt flinched, and then, impossibly, he found a new gear. He kicked, not with desperation, but with power. One stroke, two, three. His chest bumped against the side of the raft, a solid, living impact. "That's it," she yelled, her voice tearing. "One more." The bottom of the raft scraped on sand. The bow lurched to a halt. The colt's front hoof hit solid ground. He staggered, his legs collapsing under him. He fell to his knees in the shallow water, his body heaving. They had made it. For a moment, Claire could only stare, her mind numb. The roar of the river, the cold, the pain in her arms, it all faded away. All that was real was the feeling of solid ground beneath them, and the sight of the colt, alive. She unclipped the rope with numb fingers and stumbled out of the raft. The colt struggled to his feet, trembling violently, water streaming from his hide. He took a shaky step, then another. His head turned, and his eyes found hers. There, in the depths of his gaze, she saw it. Not just animal instinct. It was recognition, understanding. The world had tried to kill him, and this one human had refused to let it happen. "You're okay," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. "You're okay." The colt took another step, and another. He walked right up to her, his body swaying with exhaustion. He lowered his head and gently, so gently, he pressed his wet muzzle against her trembling hand. The touch was electric. It was a thank you, spoken in a language older than words. Tears streamed down Claire's face, mixing with the mud and river water. She reached out with her other hand and touched his nose. He had not chosen fear. He had chosen trust. And then she heard it. A low rumble that grew into a thunderous drumbeat. The ground began to shake. She looked up, her heart leaping into her throat. The herd. They were coming. They poured down the bank and onto the sandbar, a wave of muscle and wild energy. They fanned out, surrounding her and the colt. Her mind screamed at her. Danger, wild animals, cornered, but there was no aggression in their eyes, no flattened ears, no bared teeth. They formed a perfect, silent circle around the two of them. It wasn't a threat. It was an assembly, a gathering. Her pulse was a frantic bird beating against her ribs. She was terrified, but she was also in awe. This was deliberate. This was planned. This was a ceremony, and she was at the center of it. Then the circle parted. Storm, the black stallion, stepped forward. He moved with a slow, regal grace, the scar on his shoulder a pale slash of silver in the dim light. He was immense, a creature of myth and power. He stopped just a few feet in front of her. She could feel the heat radiating from his body. She stood frozen, every muscle locked, knowing that one wrong move could be her last, and then he did something that shattered her reality. Storm lowered his head. Slowly, deliberately, he bowed until his forehead almost touched the sand. His dark, intelligent eyes never left hers. It wasn't submission. It was respect. It was acknowledgement. A wild king, bowing to a human. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't move. She could only watch as the impossible unfolded before her. He held the bow for a long, silent moment. Then he raised his head and turned back to the herd. And the world exploded in sound. A chorus of voices erupted from every horse, a wild symphony that echoed off the valley walls. They stomped their hooves in unison, churning the sand into a swirling cloud. The sound was deafening, pressing in on her, vibrating through her bones. The herd began to move, weaving in a slow, spiraling dance around her and the colt. Sunlight broke through the clouds, cutting through the dust and mist, turning the scene into something from a dream. Beside her, the rescued colt lifted his head, and his own voice joined the chorus, a clear, piercing cry of survival and belonging. Claire stood in the center of the storm, trembling, overwhelmed. She was no longer a ranger. She was no longer an intruder. She was a witness. She was part of a ritual so ancient, so profound it had no name. This wasn't chaos. It was a ceremony of thanks, a story being written into the memory of the herd. They hadn't just seen her act. They had answered it. Slowly the sound began to fade. The stomping hooves grew quiet. The dust settled. A profound silence fell over the sandbar, broken only by the sound of breathing. Dozens of breaths, all in unison. Claire pressed a hand to her chest, feeling her own heartbeat fall into rhythm with theirs. "There's no protocol for this," she whispered, her voice breaking. She looked at Storm, at the head of the silent circle. She looked at the colt, standing steady at her side, and she understood. They had accepted her. They had made her part of their story. The first sound to break the silence was the angry buzz of an engine. A park service boat rounded the bend, two rangers in orange vests, staring in disbelief. The magic of the moment shattered. "Donovan, are you okay?" One of them shouted over the motor. The herd didn't bolt. They didn't scatter. They stood their ground, a silent, watchful wall of muscle. They were waiting for her. It was as if the ceremony wasn't over until she said it was. Storm lowered his head one last time, a final silent farewell. Only when Claire took a step toward the boat did the herd begin to move. They didn't run. They walked away, slowly, deliberately, melting back into the landscape they belonged to. The rescued colt, the one she now thought of as River, lingered for a moment. He looked at her, then lifted his head and let out a long, clear call. It wasn't a cry of distress. It was a song of life. It echoed down the valley, a promise. "Donovan, let's go," the ranger in the boat called, throwing her a line. She stepped aboard, the cold aluminum deck a shock after the sacred sand. Her colleagues stared at her, then at the last of the retreating horses. "Report," the helmsman said, his voice laced with confusion. Claire picked up the radio, her eyes still on the empty sandbar. "Base, this is Donovan," she said, her voice clear and steady. "The colt is alive. Rescue successful." She paused. "The herd, they did not behave as expected. They accepted my presence." There was a long silence on the other end. "Clarify, Donovan," the dispatcher said. "They formed a circle," she said, knowing how insane it sounded. "The lead stallion approached me. He bowed." The rangers in the boat just stared at her. "I've never heard of anything like that," one of them muttered. "Neither have I," Claire said, looking down at her cut and trembling hands. "But I know what I saw." In the weeks that followed, the river calmed and the world tried to return to normal. Claire filed her report. She left out the word ceremony and bowed, using phrases like coordinated display and unusual proximity. She had a tense meeting with her supervisor, who reminded her of the rules, of the career she had almost thrown away. But in the end, they closed the file. No punishment, no reprimand. It was as if they knew, on some level, that what happened at Delta 7 didn't fit into any of their tidy boxes. But for Claire, nothing was normal anymore. The valley felt different, charged with a new energy. One morning, weeks later, she was on patrol and found herself pulling over at that same spot, overlooking the river. She lifted her binoculars. And there they were. The herd was grazing peacefully in a meadow, and standing slightly apart from the others was River. He looked up as if he'd been waiting for her. He was no longer the gaunt, terrified creature from the flood. He was strong, his coat shining in the sun. He took a few steps toward the road, closing the distance between them. Claire didn't get out of the truck. She just watched. In the meadow, Storm, the great black stallion, flicked an ear in their direction, but didn't rise. The other horses continued to graze. They weren't alarmed. They weren't afraid. A human was here. And it was okay. The truth hit Claire with the force of a physical blow. They remembered. What happened on that sandbar wasn't a fluke. It wasn't a strange, isolated event. It had become part of them, part of their history, part of their law. She had broken the human rules to save one of them, and in return, they had broken their own rules for her. She sat there for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled. The rules were important, she knew that. They were a line drawn to protect the wild from human arrogance. You are guardians, not gods. But sometimes the harm was already done. Sometimes the scales were already tipped by a carelessly discarded net, by a river reshaped by concrete and steel. In those moments, standing back and doing nothing wasn't guardianship. It was abandonment. Law keeps the world in balance, she thought. But sometimes compassion is the only thing that can restore a balance we've already broken. In the meadow, River lowered his head and went back to grazing. Claire started the truck. As she pulled away, she glanced in her rearview mirror. He was still there, watching her go. Not with fear, not with gratitude, but with recognition. A silent acknowledgement that passed between two worlds on a quiet morning by the river that had almost taken everything, but had instead given them both something new. Something impossible, something true. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey. If this story moved you, let us know your favorite part in the comments below. Your thoughts and stories mean the world to us. Don't forget to like this video, share it with someone who loves a good story, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next adventure. Hit that notification bell, and we'll see you again soon.